Why you think you need everything figured out before starting. You keep telling yourself you'll start once you feel ready, once the plan is clearer, once the fear disappears, once you know exactly how things will turn out. But the truth is, most people aren't stuck because they lack talent or opportunity. They're stuck because they believe certainty must come before action, and certainty almost never comes first. You were taught that mistakes mean failure, not directly, maybe, but consistently, quietly, repeatedly, in ways that shaped how you now approach anything uncertain. In school, mistakes were marked in red. They lowered your grade. They were something to correct, erase, and avoid repeating. The message wasn't just try again. It was don't get it wrong next time. Over time, you didn't just learn facts, you learned that being wrong had consequences. Outside of school, the same idea showed up in different forms. Adults praised results, not attempts. Success stories were told after everything worked out, not during the messy middle. People were admired for what they achieved, not for how many times they failed along the way. So slowly, without anyone explicitly saying it, you absorbed a rule. If I make mistakes, I'm doing something wrong with myself, not just something new. That rule changes how you move through life, because once mistakes start to feel like failure, you begin avoiding anything where you can't guarantee the outcome. You don't just avoid being wrong, you avoid situations where being wrong is possible, which means you avoid most things that require growth. You start choosing safety over learning, familiarity over progress, thinking over doing, and it feels reasonable, even responsible. You tell yourself you're just being careful, but underneath that caution is something else, a quiet belief that your value is tied to how correct you are on the first attempt. This is where many people get stuck, not from lack of ability, but from overprotecting their identity. Because mistakes don't just challenge your actions, they challenge your self-image. If you thought you were the kind of person who is good at things, then being bad at something new feels threatening, not just uncomfortable, but personal. So, you delay starting, you over-prepare, you wait until you feel ready enough to avoid the possibility of looking incompetent. You try to eliminate uncertainty before you move, even though uncertainty is exactly what movement is for. But here's the part that quietly contradicts everything you were taught. Mistakes are not evidence of failure. They are evidence of participation. Nothing meaningful is learned in a straight line. Every skill worth having is built through correction, repetition, and adjustment. The wrong turn isn't the opposite of progress, it's part of it. If you look closely at anyone who's competent in something, you don't find a history of avoiding mistakes. You find a history of continuing despite them. They didn't start out knowing. They started out not knowing and stayed long enough to improve. The difference was never perfection. It was tolerance for being imperfect in motion. At some point, progress requires a shift in definition. Mistakes stop being treated as verdicts and start being treated as information. Not signs that you should stop, but signals that you're actually engaging with something real. Because the real alternative to mistakes isn't success, it's inaction. And inaction feels safe, but it doesn't build anything. It doesn't refine you. It doesn't teach you anything you can't already imagine. Mistakes, on the other hand, are where feedback lives. They are where direction becomes visible. They are where vague intention turns into actual skill. You were taught that mistakes mean failure, but in practice, they are the first proof that you've started. Planning feels safer than starting. It feels responsible, even intelligent. You tell yourself you're being thorough, careful, strategic. You're not rushing. You're building a foundation. You're making sure you do it right. And on the surface, that makes sense. Planning reduces uncertainty. It turns something intimidating into something organized. It gives you a sense of direction without exposing you to risk. But there's a subtle trap inside it. Planning can simulate progress without requiring it. You can research endlessly, compare options, watch tutorials, sketch ideas, refine systems, rewrite your approach, and each step feels like movement, because your mind is engaged and your time is occupied. Yet nothing has actually been tested. No real feedback has arrived. No mistake has surfaced. No correction has been forced. Everything still exists in a space where it can be adjusted without consequence. That's why planning feels safe. It allows you to stay in control of the version of the project that exists in your head. Starting removes that safety. The moment you begin, reality enters the process. Things don't respond the way you expected. Your timing is off. Your assumptions break. You notice gaps you didn't see while thinking about it. And suddenly, the project stops being theoretical, it becomes interactive. That shift is uncomfortable, not because you're doing something wrong, but because you're finally doing something real. This is where many people get stuck, not in confusion about what to do, but in over-preparation designed to delay the discomfort of exposure, because starting carries a different kind of responsibility. When you start, you can no longer say, I'm just figuring it out. You're now accountable to what actually happens. Your ideas are no longer safe in theory, they are being tested against reality. And that testing is where growth lives. Planning gives you the illusion that you can eliminate risk before action. But most real learning doesn't happen before you start. It happens because you started without knowing everything. No plan survives first contact with reality intact. Not because planning is useless, but because reality is more complex than prediction. The purpose of planning is not to create certainty. It is to make starting easier, not to replace it. At some point, planning stops being preparation and starts becoming postponement. You feel it in small ways. The plan keeps expanding, but the start date keeps moving. You feel busy, but not exposed. You feel productive, but not challenged. And without noticing it, you begin to confuse mental motion with actual progress. Starting breaks that illusion, because starting forces feedback. It compresses theory into experience. It turns what if into what happens. And while that can feel destabilizing at first, it is also the only way clarity becomes real. You don't think your way into understanding, you interact your way into it. People often imagine that successful action begins with a perfect plan. But in reality, most useful plans are built during action, not before it. The first version is never complete. The first attempt is never optimal, but it is enough to generate information that thinking alone cannot produce. That's the key difference. Planning produces ideas, but starting produces information, and information is what actually changes direction, improves skill, and refines judgment. So planning feels safer because it delays exposure, but it also delays learning. Starting feels uncertain because it removes protection, but it also introduces reality, the only place where progress actually happens. At some point, the question is no longer, do I have the perfect plan? It becomes, am I willing to let the plan be imperfect in order to begin? Because planning can prepare you, but only starting can move you forward. You're trying to avoid the identity shift, not just the effort of starting something new, but the subtle, uncomfortable change in who you become when you actually begin. Because before you start, everything exists safely in theory. You are someone who wants to write, wants to get fit, wants to build something, wants to change. Those versions of you feel clean, protected, unchallenged. They exist, without risk of contradiction. But the moment you start, that identity becomes exposed to reality. Now you're not someone who wants to write. You're a writer who might be bad at writing. You're not someone who wants to get fit. You're someone training, struggling, and being measured against consistency. You're not someone who might build something. You're someone whose attempts can succeed or fail in real time. That shift sounds small, but psychologically, it's enormous. Because identity is just what you say about yourself. It's what you can repeatedly prove without too much internal conflict, and starting something new interrupts that stability. It introduces evidence you haven't fully integrated yet. This is why so much delayed doesn't look like avoidance of work. It looks like preparation. You tell yourself you're getting ready, learning more, thinking it through, waiting for the right conditions. But underneath that is often something quieter, resistance to becoming the person who is currently in the process, not the person imagining it. The imagined version of you is always competent, always composed, always further along than where you actually are. It doesn't make mistakes. It doesn't get exposed. It doesn't have to confront gaps in skill or understanding. But real identity is built through friction. The first time you do something, you are no longer just deciding who you are testing it. And that testing creates tension, because results may not match the internal story you've been telling yourself. If you've built an identity around potential, starting threatens it. Potential is clean. It exists without evidence against it. It can always be almost ready. But action replaces potential with performance, and performance cannot stay abstract. This is why starting can feel strangely heavy, even when the task itself is simple. It's not the task, it's what the task implies about you once you engage with it. You're not just risking failure, you're risking discovering that you are currently not yet who you hoped you were. So, you stay in the space before identity is tested, the planning space, the thinking space, the soon space. It feels safer because nothing is being defined in real terms. You can still be anything there, but nothing is being built either. The uncomfortable truth is that identity doesn't shift before action. It shifts because of action. You don't become a writer and then write. You write, and in doing so, become someone who writes. You don't become disciplined and then act consistently. You act consistently until discipline becomes a description of what you've already done repeatedly. The shift is not instant, and it's not clean. It usually starts with contradiction. You act in a way that doesn't fully match your self-image yet. You feel slightly out of alignment with who you think you are. That tension is the beginning of change. Most people interpret that tension as a sign to stop, but it's actually a sign that something real is forming. Avoiding the identity shift keeps you consistent with a version of yourself that is untested, unchallenged, and therefore stable, but it also keeps you exactly where you are. Whereas moving through that discomfort doesn't just change what you do, it changes what you can honestly call yourself. And eventually, the question stops being whether you're ready to start. It becomes whether you're willing to let the current version of you be disrupted long enough for a new one to take shape. You think successful people had a perfect plan, a clear roadmap, a confident starting point, a detailed sequence of steps that, if followed correctly, led them exactly where they wanted to go. It's an understandable belief because that's how success is usually shown after the fact. When you see the finished result, it looks intentional, organized, almost inevitable. The messy parts are gone. The uncertainty is invisible. What remains is a clean story that suggests clarity was there from the beginning. But that story is edited. Most real paths don't begin with certainty. They begin with a rough direction, not a precise blueprint. People don't usually know exactly what they're doing when they start. They just know enough to begin moving, and movement is where clarity comes from. The illusion of the perfect plan is strongest when you're not in motion yourself. From the outside, it looks like others had answers you don't. It looks like they avoided the confusion you're currently stuck in, but that's not what actually happened. It's just what became visible at the end. In reality, most successful people were reacting far more than they were executing a flawless strategy. They adjusted, they corrected, they abandoned ideas that didn't work, they learned things they couldn't have known in advance. Their plan wasn't perfect, it was evolving. This is the part that gets missed. Planning is not a one-time event that precedes success. It's a continuous process that gets refined through action. The first version is almost always incomplete, not because people are careless, but because reality cannot be fully predicted from a starting point. You can't think your way into full understanding of something you haven't experienced yet. So, instead, you begin with assumptions. You test them, you update them, you discover what actually matters and what doesn't. The plan becomes something that lives inside the process, not something that exists fully formed before it. What looks like a perfect plan from the outside is usually a long series of small adjustments that only made sense in hindsight. There's also another distortion at play. You see outcomes, not iterations. You see the business that worked, not the failed versions that came before it. You see the confident speaker, not the early attempts that were uncertain and awkward. You see the finished product, not the discarded ideas that didn't survive development. This creates a false comparison. You compare your beginning to someone else's ending, and that comparison quietly reinforces the belief that you're missing something they had from the start: a clarity, a structure, a plan that guaranteed success. But what they actually had was willingness to proceed without that guarantee. They didn't wait for certainty. They generated it through engagement. Each step gave them information the previous step couldn't provide. Each mistake narrowed their direction. Each adjustment replaced assumption with experience. The plan didn't prevent uncertainty, it depended on it being encountered. At some point, the idea of a perfect plan becomes less useful than it seems. Because if you wait for it, you delay the only thing that creates real understanding, interaction with reality. You don't need a flawless map to begin. You need a direction that's good enough to test, something small enough to act on, flexible enough to change, and strong enough to move you forward. Because successful paths aren't usually discovered fully formed. They're constructed while walking them, and what looks like certainty from the outside is often just the result of enough steps, taken in uncertainty to eventually make the path visible. Fear of judgment keeps you frozen, not because you can't act, not because you don't know what to do, but because somewhere in the background of every decision is the imagined audience watching how it turns out. You don't just think about the task, you think about how it will look if it goes wrong, who might notice, what it might say about you, whether it will confirm something you don't want to believe about yourself. And so you delay, you refine, you wait, you prepare longer than necessary, you stay in the stage where nothing is visible yet, because invisibility feels safer than exposure. But the irony is that most of the judgment you fear is not actually happening. It's being simulated in your mind. You are reacting not to real criticism, but to anticipated criticism, not to actual feedback, but to imagined interpretation. And that imagined audience is often far more attentive, critical, and persistent than real people ever are. Most people are not watching closely enough to analyze your every mistake. They are focused on themselves, on how they are being perceived, what they are doing next, what they might have gotten wrong in their own lives. But fear doesn't operate on probability. It operates on perception, and the perception is, if I'm seen struggling, I will be evaluated. So, you try to avoid being seen in the early stages. You want to appear competent before you begin. You want your first attempt to already look like a refined version of your capability. You want to bypass the part where you are learning in public, but that bypass isn't possible. Everything new requires a beginning phase where you are not yet good at it. And that phase is exactly what fear of judgment targets. It turns the normal process of learning into something that feels socially risky. This is how people become stuck in invisible cycles of preparation. They don't avoid ambition, they avoid visibility while still developing it. They want the outcome without the exposure that producing the outcome requires. So they stay in private improvement, private thinking, private planning, where nothing can be criticized because nothing is being shown. But growth doesn't fully happen in privacy. It happens in contact with reality, and reality includes feedback. The discomfort comes from believing that feedback is personal rather than informational. When feedback feels like a reflection of worth instead of a reflection of behavior, every mistake becomes heavier than it needs to be. A wrong attempt stops being "this didn't work" and becomes "this says something about me." That interpretation is what creates paralysis. Because if every action is tied to identity, then every action carries risk far beyond its actual consequence. It's no longer just about doing something poorly, it's about what doing it poorly might imply. And so inaction becomes the safest option, not because it leads anywhere, but because it avoids interpretation altogether. Yet inaction has its own form of exposure. It quietly preserves the very fear it's trying to avoid, because nothing challenges the imagined judgment more than real attempts do. And without attempts, the imagined audience remains powerful, undefined, and untested. The only way it weakens is through experience. You start doing things imperfectly, you see what actually happens. You realize most reactions are mild, brief, or non-existent. You discover that people are far less invested in your performance than your fear suggested. And more importantly, you discover that your ability to recover matters far more than your ability to be flawless. Judgment loses its grip when it's no longer treated as a verdict on who you are, but as one small piece of information among many. Because the truth is, you're not being held back by judgment itself. You're being held back by the anticipation of it. And anticipation can only be corrected by experience, not avoidance. Action creates confidence, not the other way around. It feels natural to believe confidence comes first, that you're supposed to feel ready before you begin, certain before you commit, steady before you act. But if that were true, most people would already be doing the things they keep postponing. In reality, confidence is rarely a starting condition. It's a result, a byproduct of exposure, repetition, and evidence collected through experience. At the beginning, there is usually uncertainty, not clarity, not assurance, just a decision to try something without knowing how it will go. And that's where the misunderstanding begins, because people interpret uncertainty as a signal to wait. They assume the discomfort means they're not prepared yet. But discomfort is not proof of unreadiness. It's often just proof of inexperience. Nothing feels confident before it's been practiced. Think about any skill that now feels natural. Speaking, writing, working, building, creating, communicating. There was a time when each of those felt awkward, slow, self-conscious. You were aware of every move because nothing was automatic yet. But you didn't think your way into ease. You acted your way into familiarity. That's the part that gets overlooked. Confidence is built through repetition, not reflection. You try something. It doesn't go perfectly. You adjust. You try again. You notice what works and what doesn't. Over time, the uncertainty doesn't disappear all at once. It shrinks, slowly, through accumulated proof that you can handle what happens. That proof is what we call confidence. Without action, there is no proof, only theory, and theory has a way of staying fragile. You can imagine yourself being capable, but you don't yet have evidence that survives contact with reality. So confidence remains conditional, something that exists only as long as nothing tests it. Action removes that condition. It introduces feedback. It creates reference points. It turns vague self-belief into something grounded. I've done this before, and I can do it again. Even mistakes contribute to this process. In fact, they are essential to it, because mistakes don't just show what doesn't work, they show that nothing catastrophic happens when things go wrong. That realization is a major component of confidence. You stop treating failure as a threat and start treating it as information. That shift doesn't come from thinking differently. It comes from experiencing outcomes repeatedly enough to revise your assumptions. This is why waiting to feel confident often produces the opposite result. The longer you delay action, the less evidence you collect. And without evidence, confidence has nothing to attach itself to. It doesn't grow in preparation. It grows in participation. There's also a quieter transformation that happens through action. You start to trust your ability to respond, not just your ability to plan. Before action, confidence is imagined as knowing exactly what will happen. After action, confidence becomes knowing you can adapt when you don't. That difference matters, because real situations rarely follow a script. Conditions change, mistakes happen, unexpected variables appear, and confidence in those moments isn't about prediction, it's about recovery. People who look confident aren't always those who started that way. They are often people who have simply been through enough cycles of trying, adjusting, and continuing that uncertainty no longer stops them. They've built a history of surviving imperfect attempts, and that history becomes internal evidence. Even if I'm not sure, I can still move forward. So confidence doesn't precede action. It accumulates from it, which means the starting point is not certainty, it's willingness. The willingness to act before you feel fully ready, knowing that readiness is something you develop along the way. Because in the end, confidence isn't what gets you started, it's what gets built because you started. Everything you've been waiting for, clarity, confidence, certainty, readiness, tends to be treated like a starting point, something you're supposed to gather before you begin, something you earn in advance. But in practice, none of it arrives on schedule. Clarity doesn't show up first, it forms through repeated exposure to uncertainty. Confidence doesn't appear before action, it builds from evidence created by action. Even mistakes, judgment, and imperfect attempts are not interruptions to progress, they are the material progress is made from. What keeps people stuck is not a lack of understanding, it's the belief that understanding must come before experience, that thinking must finish its work before doing can begin. But life doesn't work in that order. You don't think your way into a fully prepared version of yourself and then act. You act, and through that action, you become more prepared than you were before. Every idea in this series points to the same shift, away from waiting for certainty and toward engaging with uncertainty, away from protecting an ideal version of yourself and toward building a real one through experience. Mistakes stop being failures when they become feedback. Planning stops being progress when it replaces action. Identity shifts when it is tested, not when it is imagined. Judgment loses power when it is experienced rather than anticipated. Confidence emerges not from reassurance, but from repetition. So, the question is not whether you feel ready. It's whether you are willing to begin before you do. Because the people who eventually move forward are rarely the ones who figured everything out first. They are the ones who started anyway and let experience do the rest.